Hey everybody, John here, coming at you from the frozen tundra of central Indiana. Yesterday our air temperature got up to a whopping 20 degrees. But anyways, this week we're going to talk about kind of like a beginner's guide to bass jigs. To help some of you guys that aren't real familiar with them, maybe never thrown them. And what we're talking about is skirted jigs. But we're going to kind of walk through some of the different styles, what they're good for, where some of them don't do real well, where some of them really excel, and different trailers to throw on them. So stick with me here. We're going to dive into it. Alright everybody, the first jig we're going to talk about, being that it is wintertime for most of the country, unless you're lucky enough to live in Florida. Lucky suckers. But this right here is a jig that I was talking about in the video that I did for the winter time or midwinter smallmouth. This is the Venom Lures $100,000 jig, or Ron Yerkuro's $100,000 finesse jig. I'll show a package here in just a moment. But this one right here, as you can see, it incorporates some hair with some really thin living rubber. And what I really like is this one here comes pre-set up with a small piece of soft plastic to help keep the trailer running straight if you're using like a chunk style trailer. This one here is a 1/4 ounce. That's kind of what I'm taking a liking to. I've been throwing this a lot in the river, and the 1/4 ounce stays down a lot better. It doesn't get washed downstream as much by the current. This one here is just a black. And the nice part about a black jig like this is you can throw pretty much any color trailer on it and it completely changes the jig. This one here's got a nice thin wire hook. It's not the beefiest that I've ever seen, and it's not the thinnest that I've ever seen. Now a jig like this right here, you can get away with throwing it on a casting style rod, but I wouldn't go above medium power with this hook right here. I was throwing it on a spinning rod, medium heavy, and it seemed like I was kind of overpowering the hook. There's a few fish that I stuck that came loose, and I'm pretty sure I probably tore their mouth open pretty bad on the hook set. So I kind of started taking it a little easier on the hook set with that medium heavy power rod. But a jig like this, being that it is kind of like a micro jig, I'm going to throw a couple different trailers on it. And when I say a couple, I mean two. There are two trailers that I'm going to use. And this is one of the ones that Venom Lures makes. It's kind of a mini chunk. And remember, like I said, just by changing your trailer color completely changes the appearance of the jig. So just because it's a black jig, I throw this right here on there, and this is the exact color that I was throwing with that black jig, and it was catching some fish. But this mini chunk right here, this is, like I said, a Venom Lures, their own chunk. This is one that I'm going to throw on it, on that little finesse jig. Another one that I like to throw, and this right here is a Cabin Creek spider grub. And this is the mini, the small one. This is the perfect size to put on that little hair jig. And this hair jig, you can fish it any time of the year. You don't have to just fish it in the winter time. I've thrown some of the bigger hair jigs that I have in the middle of summer. It's just a very small profile. That hair really undulates really well underwater, and it just gives the fish something different to look at. Because everybody in the summer is out there throwing, bigger jigs, flipping it in the brush, stuff like that. It just gives them something different to look at. Now, we're going to talk about another finesse jig. This one here is a This is a Jewel Baits, Jewel Bait Company finesse jig. And this is a standard round ball finesse jig. Typically your finesse jig is going to have the skirt cut where it creates this little collar. And they do that by using two different bands on the skirt. There's actually a collar underneath it here. See if it'll show it. There we go. You can see that red band there. That's actually the collar that gives it that really nice flare. Should you want to make a finesse jig of your own out of another jig, one thing that you can do to really make that that skirt flare around the jig head without having to make your own skirts and all that good stuff, you can actually take a piece of braid and cinch it down really tight right against the head of the jig, and it will cause that skirt to flare out really well. On a finesse jig like this, 5/16 is, you know, kind of the max that I'm gonna use, and that's mainly because of the rod that's required to throw something like this. You're typically not going to throw a little ball-headed jig with a light wire hook, and that's the key, is this little light wire hook here. You can see how thin that is. And this is a stinger hook is the style that they use. It kind of makes that trailer stand up on the end a little bit. But you're typically not going to go over a 7-foot medium heavy. That's still getting up there in the power range. On this, I typically use a medium power rod. But you know, something like that right there. And let me back up for a second. I have thrown it on much heavier rods with big line, flipping it down into on the Kokomo Reservoir. There's a lot of emergent vegetation that comes up, and or we call it grass. But it can get pretty thick, and I have thrown that jig in there. It works fine. But on a little finesse jig like this, like I said, 5/16 is about the heaviest that I go on this particular one. But with that, I'm going to throw a couple basic style trailers. One of the best trailers that you can use on a little finesse jig like that, just a twin tail grub. This is a Zoom Fat Albert twin tail grub right here. Another one that I really like to throw is the 3-inch Berkeley Chigger Chunk. There's some cat hair on there. You'll have to ignore that, guys. But anyways, this is a phenomenal bait to use as a trailer. It pairs up with that little finesse jig extremely well. But these two finesse jigs that we've covered so far, both of these here, are phenomenal wintertime baits. I'm typically going to fish them around rock. A ball-headed jig comes through rock pretty well. I'm not going to say that it's the greatest at it, but it's definitely not it's not bad. So we've got those two there out of the way. Oh, let me back up for a second. I don't have any sitting here. They're out in my boat, and I'm sorry, but I'm not going to go trudging out through 4 inches of snow right now to go get them. But a beaver, I like to use the Reaction Innovations Smalley beaver, but this is a Yum. It's about the same size. It might be a little bit longer, but it definitely is thicker. But this is a Yum. I think they call it a Bad Mama. These work really well. It gives a good bluegill imitation. But those are good trailers to use. But I'm going to bump on up to the next jig that I want to discuss. And I'm going to, here at the end, I'll go through some of the other things about these jigs. Excuse me. Now the next one I want to talk about, this is a standard flipping jig. This is just an old one that I had laying around in here. The hook's rusted on it and I'm not going to use it anymore. But there are some components on this jig that I want to keep. One being the rattle on it. and obviously the skirt. This one here is a Terminator. It's their pro model flipping jig. But the nice part about a flipping jig is this cone-shaped head that it has. That cone-shaped head comes through grass and wood really well. Definitely wouldn't fish this down on a rocky bank or anything, because it'll get hung pretty quick. That is the downside to a flipping style jig. But a flipping jig typically has a pretty beefy hook. You can see this one here has got a pretty good hook on it, and a stout weed guard, because it is designed for flipping into heavier stuff. Now on a flipping jig, your trailer's options are pretty much endless, depending on the profile that you're going for. This is a full-size Reaction Innovations Sweet Beaver. This is an awesome trailer to use as a jig trailer. Or I'm sorry, bait to use as a jig trailer, because it's flat. And you can skip a flipping jig. A flipping jig will skip. It's just the way the head is designed, it wants to catch the water a little bit more, and it doesn't skip as well as some of the others, but it does skip. I can't get from one side of a boat dock and hit the bank on the other with this, but I can get it underneath there pretty good ways and present another lure to those fish that they probably don't see very often. But with a full-size beaver, I'll typically cut it down, about the 4th or 5th rib, and then put it on the trailer, so it'll end up looking something kind of like that. But another good trailer to use on those is an old standby Rage Crawl. Awesome trailer. It's got plenty of action. You just cut it down a little bit depending on the profile that you're going for. This jig right here, you can see where I've cut some of the strands shorter, just to make that profile a little bit smaller. Another good trailer for that is just a standard chunk. This is the Zoom Super Chunk. Now on the Finesse Jigs, I will throw a Super Chunk Junior on those. But all these trailers, the bigger the jig I go, the more crossover there is of the trailers. For instance, the flipping jig, I'll put the twin tail grub on there. Usually on a chigger crawl, I'm going to use the 4-inch instead of the 3-inch. But on the flipping jig, I'm typically using a 7'3" medium heavy power rod up to a 7'6" heavy with 15 to 20 pound test. It just depends on what I'm fishing. Oh crap, I forgot a trailer. We'll cover it in the next video on jigs. I'll be covering it again. But we're going to jump on over to another jig that I really like to throw, and it has a lot of options. This is I think it's a V&M pacemaker jig, and this is a Arkie style head. So it's kind of a cross between a football head and a flipping jig. Now what makes this Arkie style head pretty unique, one, is because it's so flat here on the back of the head, it skips exceptionally well. And then another thing that makes it unique is I'll throw it as a swim jig. I'll put a Rage Crawl or a Kitech or something like that. I'll put it on the back of this jig, and as it comes through the water, this jig here actually wants to roll a little bit. I know I'm over exaggerating it here, but it gets a nice little roll side to side when you're using a single tail grub, which is the other trailer I forgot to bring over here. But This one right here, like I said, it skips really well. I'll typically throw this on a 7-foot to a 7.4 heavy if I'm skipping. I prefer big line, stout rod, and this one here has a really good hook. It's a pretty beefy hook with a big wide gap on it. One thing I do sometimes, depending on the cover that I'm fishing and the size of the fish in the lake that I'm typically seeing, is I'll trim this weed guard down a little bit, because this one is pretty stiff. But the nice part is it comes pre-trimmed. I mean, right there at the barb of the hook, if you can see that, the weed guard ends right at the barb of the hook, which is about where you want to trim them up. All the jigs that we've got out here today, with an exception of the flipping jig, are brand new. The flipping jig has, all of them but the flipping jig are brand new, never seen the water, no modifications to them. Just to throw that out there. But with the with that Arkie style head, I mean, your choices of trailers are endless here, guys. I mean, take your pick, throw what you want on it. If you're trying to skip with it, the flatter the bait, the easier it skips, with an exception of the twin tail grub. And that's mainly because these legs don't catch the water as much because they're so thin. It allows that jig to really skip really well. Whereas a rage crawl, these flanges that they have on the claws, will catch the water, and it will cause that jig to slow down and want to tumble end over end. It wants to nose dive into the water. But the Arkie style head does really well, like I said, for skipping. But it can do pretty much everything. It doesn't come through the cover really well, but it comes through the cover better than a football head. But it can also be fished in rocky environments or rocky bottoms where a flipping jig cannot make it through. The Arkie style head, if I had one jig that I could possibly have for the rest of my life, it's going to be an Arkie head. Some kind of Arkie style headed jig. Now, as far as weights, 1/4 ounce up to 1/2 ounce, 3/4, depending on the depth that I'm fishing. It's just exact same as what I would use on a football jig as far as weights and depths. Now, speaking of the football jig, now this is where we're changing things up a little bit. On a football headed jig, notice the head looks a lot like a football, which is where it gets its name from. This comes through rock and gravel a lot better. It will get hung up, but usually you can pop it loose, do the bow and arrow deal with the line, or shake the rod pretty hard, and it will come loose. Much more so than any of the other jigs. And this one right here is a Picasso fantasy football jig. I love these because they have a recessed line tie on them. If you can see it there, it's fairly well protected by the head. I mean, it sticks up a little bit. But the advantage to that is when you set the hook, if you have a fish hit on a fairly close to the boat or fairly close to the bank, what tends to happen is the hook eye, the line tie that is, will a lot of times jab the fish in the roof of the mouth and stick him. And you'll think you've got this fish hooked, and you get him halfway to the boat or the bank, and all of a sudden he just comes off. And that's because the hook never actually penetrated into that fish's mouth. You had the hook eye, or line tie that is, stuck in the top of the fish's mouth. It was kind of wedged there. And this one right here, I don't run into that problem as much. Now again, another thing that I like to do, or that I like to have with a football jig, is a lighter wire hook. And you see that's a fairly thin hook right there. And that's because the reason why that I like a lighter wire hook on a football jig is because I'm making extremely long casts in deep water. And I don't like using braid. I use braid in 2 applications predominantly, and that's flipping and frogging. Otherwise, I don't use braid. Well, I'll take that back. 3 situations. The third one is on spinning reels, but that's neither here nor there. But anyways, with fluorocarbon and monofilament, there's a lot of stretch, and if I have a fish hit me on the end of a 70-yard cast, which I usually use a 7'6" rod minimum when I'm using a football jig, because I'm usually fishing deep. But anyways, there's a lot of bow in that rod and a lot of stretch in the line. So if I've got a great big old hook, like what's in this flipping jig right here, that's a lot of metal to drive through that fish's mouth. And typically, from my experience, when you get them on a football jig, they're going to have it down the back of their throat. It's going to be down there in the really meaty part of their mouth. And that's a lot of meat and bone to drive a big, heavy wire hook through. Now, as far as rods and line, typically 15-pound test is my max on a football jig. There are always exceptions to that. Rod-wise, 7'3" medium heavy to a 7'6" heavy. It depends on the situation. For instance, if I'm out fishing Kentucky Lake out on the ledges and I'm stroking that jig, I'm using a 7'6" heavy, because when I rip that jig up off the bottom, I want it to be instantaneous. I want it to shoot up. So a stiffer rod really helps with that, but you want one with a good tip. Parabolic bend works really well, or moderate bend is really good for keeping those fish pinned, because you got a lot of weight. Half ounce to an ounce on a football jig is not uncommon. Now on a football jig, you're predominantly going to drag it, especially in the wintertime. You're not going to be spinning around here where you can see him. You're typically not going to be, flipping it in brush and stuff. I've seen people do it. I don't like to. But a football jig, you're typically going to drag. An Arkie style head, you can drag it, flip it, skip it, do the hula hoop, whatever you want with it. Same with the flipping jig. Now the finesse jigs, these are really good for highly pressured waters or places where you got a lot of small fish. If I was going to go fish a pond, this right here is what I'm going to have tied on 90% of the time. But the finesse jig, though, is a really versatile jig, because these skip really good. You can hop them, you can drag them, you can skip them, whatever you want to do. These are a really versatile jig. But there it is, guys. Jigs in a nutshell. Using a little jig, use little trailers. Because if you're going to go for a bigger profile, go to a bigger jig anyways. Is kind of how I look at that. So, tight lines, and we'll catch y'all next time.